Hey, everybody, welcome into the Raw Knuckles podcast. We'd really appreciate it if you'd like, subscribe, and share with a friend.
Did you have anyone that you like? Who was your best storyteller that you ever came across in your career? Do you have anyone in mind?
Well, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Chris is pretty good, as you know. Of course, he tends to ramble.
He's all right.
Yeah, I
with
can
that
go.
Boston-
I can
But
go.
that Boston accent.
When I stepped on the ice, I never backed down and I never stayed down.
And I was vicious and I was malicious and I don't care.
He's a freaking madman. Look at him going to town. That'll be a suspension. That'll be a fine.
Michael, welcome to the podcast. Appreciate it that you took the time today to come on with Knuckles and Tim Stapleton. I'll introduce you to Timothy. Michael,
Nice to see you,
How you
Tim.
doing, Mike?
I'm sure at one
good.
point you must have covered Tim in the NHL. Tim played in Toronto.
Yeah.
A little bit, Winnipeg. So you probably saw him play and didn't even know it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he probably Googled me just right before he got on. So
No, I Googled you a week ago.
okay. Fair enough. We're about honesty here. I like
Yeah,
it.
and preparation. But Mike, listen. I've always, when I think of the you being an American from New Jersey, from Bayonne, New Jersey,
Yeah.
myself being a Bostonian, two Americans, and we both end up in Montreal. We end up in the Canadiens' locker room. I know what it was like for me the first time I ever walked in that locker room. What was it like for you?
Well, I had covered the Rangers for a little while for a newspaper in New Jersey. And when Montreal came to New York, to the Garden, and to see those red sweaters, it was something. I mean, it was different. You knew you were in the presence of royalty. And now, fast forward to 1979, and there I am, and I'm walking in, and there's Dryden, and there's Lafleur, and there's Robinson, and there's Savard, and Cornway was hurt most of the time that season. But there are some of the, not only the best players in the game, but some of the most important historically. It was like walking into Yankee Stadium at dusk when it looked so green and so beautiful and so pristine, and then there'd be monuments out in center field. Well, here the monuments were living, breathing athletes. I was overwhelmed.
Yeah, and being overwhelmed, I had the same feeling, honestly, when I was overwhelmed in a different way. Again, these athletes you're talking about were the athletes I hated through my childhood growing up in Boston, because the Canadiens always beat my beloved Bruins in the playoffs. Lafleur, Robbins, I couldn't stand them. These guys, we could never beat them. And now I'm joining them. If you can't beat them, join them. But it was such a different time. And you talked about Conway being hurt mostly that year. And I remember coming in that first training camp in 79. It was 79-80 my first year, going for the fifth in a row. And Conway retired. Lemaire left. But there was still some remnants of those guys around. Savard, Lafleur, Lapointe. So I played with those greats, and it was awesome. What was the hockey? What was it for you? You get out of Rutgers, you do some work for the Bergen Record. What was it that drew you to hockey? Why not basketball? Rutgers, big basketball, football program. What draws you to hockey?
Well, when you move, you have to become local, and you know that, Chris. You can't say, oh, back where I'm from, this is how we do it. Well, I was here, and if you were going to be a sports writer in Montreal at that time, you had to know baseball, and I'd covered the Yankees in 77 and 78. But you also had to know about the Canadiens. And yeah, I knew about the Canadiens. I'd covered hockey, but I spent a lot of time in the morgue, as it's known, the library of the Montreal Gazette reading about the history of the club. So I could go in there and not be an outsider while understanding that I couldn't be anything but an outsider because where I came from. One of the great things, and I think Tim can see this, is that hockey players at that time were open, or more open. The Canadiens players used to gather at that brasserie in Alexis Neon for lunch, and I would join them. I was always welcome to join them. And the players would talk, and that was the only way you could get to know the players or know the game. So this is where I learned the game. These were my tutorials. Now, you're a different generation, Tim, right? Did you open up to writers in the same way?
No, usually writers didn't, like, I was kind of not the first choice to talk to, but no, I kind of got the end of that. I got the end of, like, the old school where, like, when we would go on the road, guys would go out and stuff, and there would be, as far as reporters, they would be around. But, like, today I can see with all the social media, it's like, guys, I don't know, the games, I talk to guys that are still playing, they're like, guys, there's, like, video game tournaments happening, like, on the road, and yeah, it's not so much about, the team being together, and definitely, like you said, it's definitely not as open as it used to be, for sure.
So that going to Cabernet was the place, and I've been there many a time. But when I came into Montreal, I felt this, and again, I felt a little bit of that adversarial bit between athletes in the media. I had people, of course, Red Fish is walking around the room like he's the grand poobah and wanted everybody to say, he wouldn't talk to rookies. He wanted everybody to say, who's that guy over there? Exactly what I did. He walked around the room every day, never came near me, where all the other media come and talk to me. And I leaned over to Bob Gainey one day and I said, hey, who's that guy over there? He said, oh, that's Red Fisher. He doesn't talk to rookies. And I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. And I finally got it. And I watched him over the years do the same gig. But that adversarial, it surprises me that you were over there with them because, that there was a bit of, like I said, us against them when it came to the media and players. Listen, you're very disarming. But there's certainly some people, they're not disarming, and they're not trusted. And I think, do you see that relationship? Did you see it when you first come in?
Perhaps I did, but, I was lucky because you didn't go to write stories. You went to learn about the game. And that's one of the things I think that penalizes younger reporters. They don't get that opportunity. And that's why, and you and I have discussed this, Chris, why so many have to be dependent on analytics and on numbers because they don't have the privilege of telling stories any other way. And analytics are great because it's information, but it doesn't take the human element into it. And if you look at civilizations, and if you look at the course of human history, storytelling is the primal imaginative act. That if you go back to cave dwellings, there weren't any decimal points in cave dwellings, right? They were telling stories about the hunt, and they were doing it with pictures, and we're doing it with words. And players, I got to know players, I got to trust I got to trust them, and they got to trust me. I was on a flight one time. It was Vancouver and St. Louis, and the Canadiens were flying a commercial, and it was a big plane, I think a 747, and I'm talking to Steve Shutt, and he says, watch this. He says, you see all those writers? They're watching Flower. They're watching Guy Lafleur to see when he starts his second drink. He'll finish his first, get his second. And once he has a sip or two of his second drink, they'll drift over, and that'll be their story for tomorrow, whatever Flower says. And it's exactly what happened. And so I had people like Steve Shutt and others who guided me to explain what was really going on and how things worked. I tried to be fair. Perhaps I wasn't always, but that was how I viewed things, and I got along for the most part pretty well with the athletes I covered.
Did you have anyone that you like? Who was your best storyteller that you ever came across in your career? Do you have anyone in mind?
Well, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Chris is pretty good, as you know. Of course he tends to ramble.
He's all right.
I can go.
But that Boston accent. Yeah, but the Boston accent. I mean, come on, enough of that. There were guys in sports, and I would, if not glom onto them, I would pay attention to them. And one of the teams I really liked, and before I got to Montreal, was the Islanders teams of the late 70s into the 80s. Those are great teams. They could beat you any way. You wanted to play a certain style, they could play it. You could play a 1-0 game or a 6-5 game. Didn't matter. They'd still beat you. They had so many interesting guys on that team that I loved being around them because they were good at their jobs and they were able to explain it to someone like me. And so I have a particular fondness. So I'm fond of smart. And that was true of the Baltimore Orioles under Earl Weaver. It was true of several Canadiens teams, including the teams that I inherited in 79, 80, and again in the late 80s. Montreal had really interesting teams. And the Islanders teams, particularly fond of them as well.
And I think I always got along pretty good with the media. There were some guys I kind of wanted to steer clear of. What do you think about some of the guys that write, and I'm sure you crossed paths with some of these people over the course of your career, guys that write not with pen, but with knife?
I didn't write with a knife.
Oh, I know you didn't. I'm just saying, what do you think
I
about
wrote with
those that do?
Well, some guys type with their fists. If I was going to get a guy, and I got guys, I tend to do it with a, little pinprick. And I did that. And Stéphane Richey, one day, I got Stéphane Richey. And this was after a Humpty Dumpty practice. You remember those?
Oh, yeah.
They let all the kids in Montreal once a year. 18,000 kids get in free. And Richey, who was a hell of a goal scorer, right? 250 goal seasons in a 3-year span, gets booed by these, what's your phrase, Chris? Snot-nosed little kids?
Snotty-nosed little kids.
Yeah. So I thought that was horrible. So I was at this practice on Sunday, and I went to talk to Richey afterwards and asked him about it. And he was down. I mean, it really affected him. So he started telling me about these astrologers that he's going to. He said he consulted 3 different astrologers. Well, maybe there's some people who are listening who are fans of astrology. But damn, I thought that was ridiculous. And I wrote a column for the following day in the Gazette that suggested if he were going to have open heart surgery, he wouldn't seek that many opinions.
No.
I mean, come on, 3 astrologers? What's that? And in the course of this column, I described him as Brett Hull without the head. So I walk into the room the next day because you write something that's tough, you show up, right? I walk into the room and he's screaming, cheap shot, cheap shot. And I'm thinking, which one? Yeah. And I'm thinking it's going to be the astrologer thing. And what bothered him was I called him Brett Hull without the head. And I said, listen, you're bigger than Hull. Your shot's every bit as good. You're a better skater. He says, well, how can you compare me? He makes $2 million a year and I make $700,000. I said, well, clearly this is not about money. I mean, that's part of the problem. You know, that's about your head. And I said, tell you what, I'm going to go home and read the column again. I'm going to come back here tomorrow and we'll talk about it. I went home and I read it, came back the next day. I said, Stefan, I wouldn't change a word. And I got and I'll paraphrase here, screw you, Usty. And we didn't talk for years. But it was so important that as a columnist, you had to have an opinion, but you also had to be fair. And honestly, Tim, I didn't think I was being unfair to Richey. And there's a postscript here. I saw him, when he was in New Jersey. I talked to him a little bit. And years later, I saw him in a restaurant in Hudson, Quebec. And he greeted me like his long-lost brother. So I guess everything's good.
Yeah, he let it slide finally, huh? I look at both of them. They both don't have heads. So I don't know what you're talking about Hull having a head.
Whoa,
I don't
wait
get
a minute.
that.
Now, as a player,
Okay.
I mean, who got to seams better than Brett Hull? I mean, who knew when to be where he had to be?
Yeah.
And I thought Richey, with his physical tools, could be that player.
No question. And you brought Sports Illustrated up, and obviously writing for them for all those years, some really big stories. And a couple I remember, Hockey's Little Helpers, right, about Sudafed, which I have popped a few back in my day. And that's all I did when I played. Now, there were a couple times in the off season I partook in some things I probably shouldn't have, but very rarely. And we know what happened to Knuckles afterwards. We won't talk about that right now. But a friend, and I want to get to, especially at that time, writing that story, Life of the Party, about Kevin Stevens. Like, here you are covering all these fine-tuned athletes all these years, and then you got Kevin all of a sudden. That was a huge story at the time. Now we see guys, they have problems, they come out. A lot of guys go into the behavioral health program, and maybe it's not so. I mean, we just saw it with Carey Price. It's not so like, wow. But Kevin Stevens back in the day was kind of wow. How big a story was that for you?
That was a big story for me. I had thought until last year that the words crack hoe had appeared in Sports Illustrated for the first and only time. So I went back and read the story, and it was edited out, which tells you that the magazine is still in school libraries. But, I mean, Kevin Stevens, I mean, Artie's a popular guy, right? I mean, he was a terrific left winger and a popular guy, but he had a problem, and a big problem, and it could have gotten him killed, as the police in East St. Louis, Illinois, pointed out to us. And he had powerful friends in the game, including Mario Lemieux and Wayne Gretzky. They were friends. And this was written over a weekend at the All-Star game in Toronto in 2000. So while everyone else is out doing all-star stuff, I'm in a hotel room putting this piece together, and I had some help with the reporting. It was a tough story to do, because what you're doing is you are taking a snapshot of somebody's life and exposing it to, at the time, 3.2 million subscribers of Sports Illustrated. And there are other things about Kevin Stevens, right? That's not the only thing, but this was a big story, and certainly what I hope was an utterly accurate portrayal of who he was at that particular moment. But sometimes we have to remember that's not the only moment. You are taking a tranche, a slice of somebody's life, and presenting it. And we go back to what we were talking about earlier, fair. And I actually went back, as I mentioned, and read the piece a couple of years ago, and I think it holds up.
So, Mike, you cover hockey. You moved to Montreal. You cover hockey. So, safe to say, if Danielle was from England, you'd be covering soccer. Yes or no?
That's very fair, but I will say this about Quebec women. They're like Guinness. They don't necessarily travel well, in my experience. They're best consumed at the place of origin. So, yeah. So I got here in '79. She didn't like New Jersey. Okay, so we'll try Montreal. And actually, I took out citizenship here in 2017. I think it's been 5 years now. So I'm a dual citizen.
Good for you. And I'm still a permanent resident and may at some point venture that way. Actually, you're the one who prodded me into becoming a permanent resident, and I did. And I thank you for that. You know, and I said that covering, you would have been covering soccer if you're over there, but you're here, and it's hockey. If there's one event in sports you could cover that you haven't yet, what would it have been? Or what would it be?
I don't know, because, again, I've had front row seats, covered the World Cup. I've covered 18 Olympics.
You've done it all.
Stanley Cups, obviously. Yeah, and I have no desire to go to Augusta to see, guys in...
It's funny. I was thinking of Augusta. How is that?
I like to play golf, and I like to play golf because once you get through the hurdles and the barriers to play golf and the snobbishness and all that other stuff, it's only about the number on the scorecard. It's a meritocracy, and that's what ultimately I like about golf. You're not discriminated against because of that terrible Boston accent you have, right? or anything else. I mean, it's you, and that's the nice thing. So, I don't need to do that.
Okay, you don't need to do that. Well, let me phrase it another way.
God,
how about you as a young lad watching monumental sporting events as a young lad? And I can think of a few, and I'm sure you can too. Which one would you have loved to have been there and covering it?
The first championship game I ever saw, and that was the Boston Celtics and the San Francisco Warriors, Russell against Chamberlain. And I would have been, I think, 12 or 11. And in those days, your mother puts you on a train when you're 11 or whatever in Newark, and your uncle picks you up at South Station, I would guess, and takes you to the Garden, and you see the deciding game of the championship. The Garden, excuse me. And, in the following year, I got to see a World Series game. So those kinds of things. You know, a story that I want to write and never had a chance. And did you, Tim? I didn't Google you well enough. Did you? Did you ever play in Europe?
Yeah, most of my career was over in Russia. I played about 8 or 9 years of my career over in Russia and Europe.
Okay. Play in Switzerland?
I played in Switzerland, yes.
So you played in Ambri-Piotta?
I played in Ambri, like a half outdoor rink, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to see Ambri-Piotta play Lugano.
I played for Lugano when I played there.
Man. Yeah. Here's your guest. You don't need me, Chris. Jeez. Because, I mean, you got the rich team against the people's team. They sing the Internationale in that rink. The wind comes whistling into that thing and from that pass. And I've heard stories, and it's a great rivalry. And, rivalries excite me, right? When you're playing Boston in the 80s, that excites me. right? Because rivalries are lifebloods of the game. There is nothing better than teams where it really matters. And that's one of the stories that I'd really like to write or do a TV thing on, because things that matter to people I want to know about.
So those rivalries, and we talk about it. You brought it up, Boston, Montreal, in hockey. We know the Yankees, Red Sox, and the Celtics, Lakers. Right, great rivalry.
Yeah, I mean, these were great. They're in the 76ers and the Celtics for a while. I mean, that was terrific. But Montreal and Boston played each other so often that I knew where Ray Bourque would stand for the national anthem and precisely when he would cross himself before the game. And this is, I loved watching these games, and I got a kick out of your being part of it, because at that time, the game was a little bit different. I think I've always been drawn, Tim, to NHL fighters, because I think I have some understanding of how difficult the job is. I think Kelly Chase once described it to me as, you're sitting in school the whole day and you're waiting for the bell to ring at 3:00, knowing that you're going to have to fight the toughest kid in school, or you might have to every day. And it's tough to think about your math equations or French when you're getting ready to do that. But with very few exceptions, in my experience, did fighters do something for their own ego. They were doing it for their teammates, for the logo, it was generally a violent act, but it was rooted in selflessness. And I can think of a couple others that, I had a player once stop me in the visiting dressing room. I was in Edmonton, and he grabbed me and said, "Hey, I've had 28 fights this year, and I started 26 of them." Well, that's not about selflessness. But in general, this is why I always had so much time for people who fought.
Well,
No, I think you said it perfectly about fighters. They're complete opposite of what they are on the ice. They're usually the nicest guys in the locker room. They're the best teammates, and it makes sense why you'd want to get to know them, because not many people, they're the complete opposite of what most people would think they would be. Are they mean? Are they, what kind of guy is he? It's actually he's a pretty down to earth, very loyal. And I have a lot of respect, obviously, for what Chris did and teammates of mine that did that. Speaking of that, did you? What's your feeling today on the game with fighting? And obviously, it's kind of being weeded out. And what's your take on all that?
Well, yeah, it's not part of the game's future, and it's barely part of the present. And the mandatory face masks are part of that. And I give credit to Gary Bettman, because rather than saying no fighting, will adopt American college rules, we will take it away from you without even you realizing it.
speaking of the commissioner of hockey, what do you think of the job he's done, and do you think his tenure's getting close to the edge, or he's just entrenched, he's not going anywhere?
Well, he's just a little younger than me, and all you have to do is look at my hair, and yeah, you're getting to the end, whether you like it or not.
Fourth quarter, that's all it is.
That's it. You sure it's not garbage time that I'm just
quarter.
running up and down waiting for the buzzer?
And I'm going to at least 4 overtimes.
Oh, well, I like that. But when I started covering hockey, and you had a question, about 5 o'clock, you'd call the NHL office. Guy would pick up a phone. Campbell.
Yeah.
Clarence Campbell would answer his own phone. Yes, Mr. Campbell. And you'd ask your question and maybe get an answer. it was basically a mom and pop shop. It was like going down to the dépanneur here, or the 7-Eleven. That was the NHL as a league. I mean, it was a local grocery store. And after Ziegler, Bettman came in, and he made it professional. This became a professional sports league. For better or worse, mostly better. You don't have the same kind of access or the same kind of feel. It was kind of nice to be covering what was essentially, Timmy in his treehouse, and that was the NHL. But this was, it was something. The first Board of Governors meeting, and this was described to me by an owner, a member of the board, and they used to be very clubby affairs, right?
Yep.
Bettman came in, and all these rich people, I mean, there was no doubt from the moment he walked in who was in charge, and they were going to have a serious league. Quite often, at least in Canada here, Bettman doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. I will tell you this. Bettman gets everything. The story about the elephant, what it is, if you only see one part of the elephant. He is the only guy who sees the whole damn elephant. Now, you may not like him. You may not want to go out for a pop with him. You may disagree with him, but he gets it. And, he and I have disagreed. But, I respect him.
Yeah, he works for the owners, no question. He's done one hell of a job as far as that goes. When, you'd think hockey in the States, it was so regional, and it wasn't on TV like it was here as much on the national stage. He got it there, which is, a big accomplishment, to say the least. And listen, you've covered hockey, obviously, athletes in hockey, the Olympics, just being around athletes most of your life. Who, I guess, would you say, as far as athletes, are you most affected by or moved by in any way?
I'm more moved by people who had to overcome something, who not the most naturally gifted, and that's true in life. People who really made something of themselves under difficult circumstances. My brother-in-law, my late brother-in-law, for one, an assistant systems guy at the Montreal Gazette who overcame stuff to do that. So, I love watching greatness, of course. If you can watch Barry Sanders run a football, or an Olympic gymnast, or watch Crosby and the way he corners and the way he just navigates in tight spaces, or watch Flower coming down the wing, or watch Mario Lemieux undress people. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that you like. But I've always had a soft spot for guys who say, okay, I've made the team, and I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to do whatever I can. So that's where I tend to go.
Yeah, I didn't hear you mention, I heard you mention Lafleur and all these guys. I didn't hear you mention anything about someone throwing an uppercut, though.
No. I remember the first time
The beauty of the uppercut.
Yeah. But, I'm comparing that with your hero, Bobby Orr.
Oh.
And the first time I saw Orr, it was the last year of the original six. I was going to high school in Providence. I take a bus on a Saturday afternoon. Bruins playing the Rangers. I paid double scalper's price for the tickets. I paid $5.
What a
Garden.
ripoff.
Oh, yeah, 100% markup. So I'm sitting up in the balcony, end arena, and I sat there with my mouth open for 2.5 hours because I'd never seen anything like Bobby Orr, but I was 15. And the greatest thing you will ever see happens when you're 15 because your sensibility has developed and you're still struck by it, and the cynicism hasn't crept in, And so the greatest joy in your life will come when you're 15. I have a daughter who's now a reporter, works for Reuters, based in Moscow when there isn't a war.
Gabrielle.
I was doing Gabrielle.
I was going to
doing a
get to
story.
Gabrielle, but you jumped the gun, and I love that, so go right ahead.
I was doing a story on, it was Le Cavalier and Richards went over during the lost season, the lockout, and they were playing for Akbars. So I hung around Akbars for a couple of weeks. Well, she was crazy about Kovalchuk. So I bought a Kovalchuk jersey, and he signed it, and I brought it home to her. And she was 15, and she went nuts in the same way that Larry Robinson got a signed brodeur stick for a son's friend who was 15 when he got it. This would have been in the 96 Stanley Cup, 95 Stanley Cup final. And it was giving it to him. I said, oh, there's something in the corner. He's 15. Just goes crazy. And you can't do that when you're 16 because you're starting to get cool, right?
Yeah.
Or cynical or grown up. But when you're 15, that's great.
Well, for me, it was 12. Bobby Orr, 1970, and then 2 years later, at 14, the second Stanley Cup. But watching Orr sneaking into the Boston Garden as a kid was some of the greatest memories. And then, and think of this. Here I am with my best friend sitting in the aisle, okay, behind the net, the opposing net, and you see Orr get the puck down the other end of the rink and take off. Everybody in the building got to their feet. Everybody. It wasn't you sat there and waited till he got to the blue line. Forget about it. When he grabbed the puck in his own end of the rink, everybody to their feet. And I'll never, and you're so right on the money with that, I'll never forget that. It was like just incredible to watch him and to have that opportunity as a young kid. So I can certainly identify with that along with you at that age. Now, you brought up Gabrielle, and I can only imagine. I went to Russia. I've been there. I got big, rough, tough Chris. This was back in around 2003, I think, the first time I went. Talk about, homesick, culture shock. I was like, these people, like, gray was a bright color there. Everybody wore black. Gray was like red there. Everybody had this hard look, just hard people. And I was like, man, this fucking place is, I don't know. I loved it architecturally. And to some extent, I did like the people, but it was really hard to squeeze your way in there and get to know it a little. But having your daughter over there in a time like this, and not just in wartime, before wartime, knowing with the president of Russia, Putin, what he's done in the past, from that poor female journalist he had offed, your daughter being a female journalist. Is it Time magazine?
She works for
Reuters now. Sorry,
news service.
But you and Danielle, and of course your son too. But were you worried at all? Like, geez, she could be writing stuff about what's going on, right? She covers what's going on in the Kremlin.
Yeah, and does some other things as well. But you were there 9
Yeah,
years?
I'm just thinking all this. I was going to let you. Yeah, I was like, I was there for 4 years. And,
4 years, okay.
Yeah, go ahead, though.
Well, she's been there for 9. And, Chris speaks American. Well, she speaks 4 languages. and her Russian is fluent. And she decided by the age of 25 that she would be fluent in Russian, and she is. And she got over there when she was 24. So in some way, Moscow's her home, and she recently had to leave it and is in another country right now doing her work from there. And she left with her suitcase, one suitcase, left her apartment, suitcase, her cat, and her computer. And that was tough. But, Moscow now is a big city. It's a pretty vibrant city. Now, that's, pre February 24th. But so, she's 33, and she's lived there, a quarter of her life now. So in some ways it becomes home. So, as a parent, you're always worried, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. But, she's done some really interesting things, including at the Olympics, breaking the story in 2021 of the defection of the Belarusian sprinter for Reuters. So, I'm proud of her. And one thing you can only do with your kids is give them opportunities. They have their own lives to live. And I try to get out of the way as much as possible.
You get out of the way.
I rush. Yeah, I was going to say with... just from my experience, I never felt not safe. When I was there, I felt safer than I do here almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, it was a lot about the people. I think that's, I like to say there's 3 phases, coming over there and being the, kind of the I don't know, dumb American, I guess you want to call it, just wanting things my way. And over time I had to be like, I'm in Russia. This isn't, America. And it was just how the people did, they just didn't do things that you would expect here, right? Maybe it'd be simple as you get out, if you come down an elevator to the hotel lobby, everyone that's waiting to go in just comes in. They don't wait for you to come out, right? So I'm knocking over 60-year-old Russian people to get out of an elevator. And so for me at first, that's what is going on here? And then over time, though, I just, I'm very grateful that I got to live there. And I actually have a lot of respect for Russian people. I think people, they get, they don't have a lot of emotion, but they're not fake, right? They're not going to be in an elevator and be like, hey, how's the weather? And then you walk away and you're like, hey, nice shoes,
But I bet you got tired of shaking hands every day.
Every day. I used to, that's funny. So, Nux, you had to, every day you came into practice, you had to shake everybody's hand.
Yeah.
And so, our coach would come in right before practice and he would go around the room. That was the first thing he would do, go around the room. So I used to try to I'm there's no way that this is, I was trying to beat the system. I would go I'd shake the coach's hand as soon as I got there, and then hour and a half would go by. He comes in the locker room, he starts going around the room, and he would skip me. He remembered shaking my hand. I would try to get him to shake my hand twice, but it was I never got him. But that was, stuff like that where it's just, like I said, over time you're fascinated. You obviously got frustrated, and then you just became Russian, and I didn't mind that.
That's
at all.
funny,
That's for sure.
Mike. Tim, he's talking about his Russian coach, but he also had Mike fucking Keenan as a coach over there. And don't tell me fucking Keenan shook your hand, right?
No,
he shook your fucking head, if anything.
He would be he tried to be like Iron Mike, they didn't know what he was saying half the time, and he would be screaming at these Russian people, whatever. Just everything, saying something about their wives or whatever it took. And these Russian players would just be like, Tim, what do you say? I'd be like, he said you're doing good. They had no idea what to say.
Well,
it was pretty funny.
We've brought up a coach, and because I know we're winding down pretty soon, you promised me, Chris, that I could tell a story about.
Listen, we don't have to wind down either
Boom,
unless
Boom
you got to be
Geoffrion.
going. So we're not.
No, I
Okay,
don't.
good.
I've got 22% on my computer. So if
Plug it in.
We got that excuse the last interview.
We had Jay Baruchel yesterday, and he gave us the old my computer's battery's dying.
No, honest to God, I can look
teasing.
at it. 22%. But, Bernie Geoffrion, one of the great goal scorers in the history of the game, one of the early purveyors of the slap shot. So he comes to Montreal as the coach in 79. I'm still wet behind the ears in Montreal, doing features for the Gazette. So I'm told I got 20 minutes with him. Okay, now remember Geoffrion had burned out very quickly in Atlanta, and with the Rangers, so there's really only one question: is how are you going to keep it together in Montreal? So 20 minutes, I got to push. I said, okay, so why is it going to be different this time? I'm a changed man. Okay. How are you changed? I'm not the guy I was. Okay. Yeah, how are you different? I've changed completely and my outlook is different. Well, can you describe that? I'm not the same guy. So I am screwed. I got nothing. So I call his wife, who happened to be Howie Morenz's daughter, Marlene. She's in Atlanta still. So I said, I talked to Bernie today, and he told me he's a different guy. Can you tell me how and what way? Give me an example. And she said, oh, yes, he became a born-again Christian. Oh, do you want me to read his testimony? Yes, please. So she goes on the phone. I got his testimony. Now, Danielle, my wife, is out of town, and I'm in bed. It's 11:30, and I'm reading. The phone rings, so I think something's happened to my wife. Mike, this is the boomer. And pardon my accent, but that's the best I can do. I said, yes, Bernie, and I had never met him until that day. You talked to my wife? I said, yes. He says, well, you can't write that. And I said, why not? This is on the record. And she says, well, I've got a mother and good Roman Catholic, and if you write that, if she's got a bad heart, it's liable to kill her, that I'm not Catholic anymore. So anyway, we go back and forth and back and forth, and finally we reach a deal that when he tells his mother, I will be the next call, and I can write it. And being a trusting, nice guy, I agree. So about 6 weeks later, prior to that, so now I've got to do a Geoffrion story, and I got nothing. Literally nothing. So I have to figure something out. So I called Jiggs McDonald, who was Geoffrion's partner, broadcast partner with the Atlanta Flames. And I said, Jiggs, can you tell me a story? He says, okay, one night, we're on the air, and he says, Jiggs, there are only 3 things to hockey: shooting and skating. And I say, that's right, Boomer, and what's the third? And he says, Jiggs, that's the tree: shooting and skating. So fast forward 6 weeks later, in the middle of a notes column in one of the French papers, ... Bernie Geoffrion is now a born-again Christian, ... So I got screwed, and I never forgave him for it. And even doing a story for Sports Illustrated years later on the death of the slap shot, because you don't see too many guys coming down the wing letting fly, right? You'll see one-timers on a power play or what have you, but, Flower coming down the wing, you don't see that. So I mentioned, oh, by the way, your grandfather screwed me. This was to Blake Geoffrion. And I told them the story. So I carry a grudge. It's like Nilan and Linsman.
Yeah, no, I'm over that with Linsman. I guess, all right, covering hockey, the superstars, Lemieux, Gretzky, Sid the Kid. Now we see McDavid. And he's still a baby in a sense, but who's that most compelling character out of those the real elite superstars?
Well, because it was so individual. I mean, Lemieux was doing things that people just weren't. I mean, Gretzky was just peering around corners. Or, again, I didn't cover him really except for the very end when he was with Chicago. But watching Mario, seeing this very big guy do these remarkable things and make people look foolish, that was extraordinary to me. What added to it is when I moved to Montreal, I lived in Villemort.
Yeah.
I lived on Rue La Croix, which was 3 or 4 streets away from Jog, which is where Mario
Yeah.
was. And if you went to the service station on a large street, there was this big poster billboard, really, of Mario. And so it felt local to me. And, his mom, Pierrette, would be in the neighborhood. So it's about connections. And this is why Montreal has been so important to me in my ability to write about hockey, because and Canada, really, because you're never more than one person removed from knowing somebody in the game. When we moved into this house in 1987, the guy carrying the couch was Ray Bourque's brother-in-law, right?
Yeah.
Scotty Bowman's parents lived diagonally across the street. About 6 months before we sold, Buddy O'Connor, a Hockey Hall of Famer, who had lived on the street, his widow sold the house. The next street behind me in Verdun, Donnie Meehan grew up. I go to a little market just in LaSalle, walk to that, and there would be Dollard Saint Laurent. And I developed this, 1 degree of separation thing, because you just knew people. Now, growing up in New Jersey, I was in Bound Brook, New Jersey at the time, and I was taken to a high school banquet where Dick Lynch, who was a defensive back for the Giants, came to speak. So I'm sitting at the back of this high school gymnasium, I guess, and there was Dick Lynch up on the dais. And that was the only athlete I'd ever seen away from a rink or a court or a baseball diamond, someone wearing a suit and tie. So they seemed far. They seemed unapproachable. They seemed to occupy a different universe. And you come to Montreal, and I presume this is, Winnipeg or elsewhere. I mean, you just come in contact. And so the game becomes personal, because these aren't merely athletes. These are neighbors. These are people that you know, or feel that you know, or your brother knows them, so therefore you know them, or your sister dated this guy or dated a teammate of this guy in junior, and so it's all there in front of you, and so the game becomes very personal and very meaningful on a level connected that people don't have elsewhere.
Yeah.
Is there like a most memorable like Olympic athlete that you can't,
Well,
to you?
I can think, I was really lucky, but I saw so many neat things, including the Miracle on Ice, which was great. And a woman named Sylvie Frechette. Does that mean anything
I
to you?
recall the name.
Yeah, it's a synchro swimmer
Okay.
who ended up getting screwed out of a gold medal by a judge who pushed the wrong thing and gave her the wrong score, and it got corrected finally. But the day before she left for the Olympics, her boyfriend with whom she lived committed suicide. And what she had to go through. And there was a Canadian rower, Silken Lauman, who had her leg torn up in an accident on the water like 6 weeks before, and then rode to a bronze medal, came back on an American in single sculls in Barcelona. So we were earlier talking about people who had to do something. And that's the kind of thing that impressed me. And Olympics are different. I'm an agnostic about it, because you can see the corruption, you can see the venality, but the performances are so spectacular. And again, I only saw Bolt run a heat, an early heat in the 200. Only time I saw him. But if you go back, I saw Phelps a lot and had to write about him for Sports Illustrated. That there was a relay race, an American kid named Jason Lezak swam the most incredible lap and pulled in a Frenchman named Alain Bernard. And to see him do that just absolutely stunned me. So if you can collect moments like that those are what I remember more than the athletes. It's just that moment and what it gives you. And because, you see things you may not ever see again. And I got to do 18 of them.
Now, I love that you frame that like you did, because a lot of people who watch the Olympics, we want to see the gold medal winner. That's what we want to see. And instead, what comes out of your mouth there, and is this a product of the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat that we grew up on? ABC Wild Wide World of Sports, the ski jumper coming down, wiping out, that thrill of victory and the agony of defeat.
I think the agony of defeat is what we focus on, because in my experience, I know it's painful to tell two athletes this, I much preferred losing dressing rooms than winning dressing rooms.
Oh,
Winning's all the same. Losing, there are many more shades to it. And so I was always going to head to the losing room
first.
Hooray, we win. Here's champagne. Well, that's okay. You won. That's great. But the guys who lost, or the women who lost, they're generally far more interesting. Now, I have a former editor at SI who admits to a certain level of cowardice. He says, I was always even afraid to go into a losing locker room. But
our friend Red Fisher, and now you're on the Hall of Fame selection committee, and that's another thing I wanted to hit you with before I lose you to a battery. But the selection committee, for the life of me, why did they wait so long to put Pat Burns in there? Why did they wait till he died to put him in? They know he was on his way out. Come on, the guy was destined to be a Hall of Famer coach, and he dies, and his wife and son have to go there and accept for him, which is an honor. That's great. But, God, to have seen Pat Burns up there accepting that, I just don't get it.
Well, I can't discuss what goes on in the meetings.
Okay.
And that's part of our agreement. Let me explain a little bit how the Hall of Fame committee works. This is my last year on it, because you can serve a maximum of 15 years, and my time will be up after the meeting in June.
Well, they're losing a great one. I know that.
Well, appreciated. So why does someone get in now and didn't get in before? And you can look at Rogi Vachon, for example. Well, the makeup of the committee changes, and people come in with different ideas and different views.
Yeah.
And so maybe that happens with some people. You say, why wasn't he in before? Or why isn't he in now? And just the committee changes. And if you want to know who the 18 members are, it's easy to find on the Hall of Fame website.
I got you. And I thought that, yeah, that bothered me, because I love Pat Burns. Listen, I only played for him near the end of my career. I should have played for him longer if I didn't get traded. He was certainly that man that I would have went through a wall for. I know it. When I got traded, he was in the American League with the Habs in Sherbrooke. And I remember after I talked to Serge about when I got traded, and I said, I mean, why? God, I would have been perfect with Pat Burns. He said, well, I didn't think he was ready. Well, he fired Perron 2 months later and brought him up. Like, what, 2 months made a difference in his career? I said, Serge, will you? Please.
Pat and I got off to a rocky start because they named him coach. And as you know, Tim, and you know, Chris, that Pat had been a cop in Hull, Gatineau. So I'm always looking to find different ways of telling a story. And so the old cliche is, who knows a cop better than his partner? Right? So somehow I found his partner and called him, and the guy told me fabulous stories about what a cop Pat had been, what a tough cop Pat had been, undercover and the whole thing. So now I'm going to see Pat. This was during the week, and now 2 days later or whatever, I'm going to see Pat for a longer feature that will run in the Gazette. And Mimi Lapointe, Chris, who was the Canadians' PR woman at the time, I would go into the Canadians' office. She said, "Oh, Pat is pissed at you." I said, "Well, what's the problem?" "Oh, geez, I don't know if he's going to do this." I said, "Well, let me see. And if he doesn't want to do it, doesn't want to do it. I don't, we'll figure out another way." So I walk in there, and Pat starts screaming at me. And tough cop, and I put away a lot of bad guys, he says, and some of them can actually read. So, one day they'll get out and they'll come looking for me, and it'll be your fault.
Oh.
So I said, well, we'll deal with that when the time comes. But we walked around his neighborhood in St. Henry, and he calmed down. And we became, you don't ever become really friends, because it's not that, because I have a job to do, he has a job to do. So, but we had a good understanding, and it was at the very end of his time in Montreal, and they were about to drop a playoff series in Boston. And I knew stuff had been bothering Pat. And Pat was, for the most part, a truth teller. So we're at the Marriott in Cambridge, and I called Pat in his room. I said, "Okay, Pat, we got to talk." And there was a pause, and he said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." So I went up to his room, and Pat basically unburdened himself because he knew he was done, and told me everything from his perspective. And that's what he did. And then I'd see him in Toronto. And one day I'm in his office, and I said, "Don't you have to be out of practice?" He says, "No, I'm just waiting to see what players are going to take charge." So we just chatted while the Leafs were practicing. He had a rule when he was coaching Montreal. Columnists, Red and me from the English side, were allowed in his office. Beat guys, talk to him in the hall. So there was a doctor named Rajan Tama who was treating AIDS patients at the time. And that was a big story. And a woman had died, one of his patients, and she had claimed to have had relations with, I think, 40 NHL players.
Ooh.
So this was a big story. So I went to see Pat, and we're in his office in 10 minutes and talking about it, but he's not saying much. And I'm literally about to get out of my chair and say, "Okay, thanks, Pat." And he says, "Yeah, and I've told Gates to put condoms in the training room. And I don't want any of these SOBs to use them as water balloons either. This is a serious thing." And he went on, and then I had my column, right? Because Pat wasn't going to let me get away without being part of a column. I mean, one day he's complaining to me about, they make me talk to the media all the time. And I said, "You don't have to talk to the media. You got a Hall of Fame defenseman on your staff. Send Jacques Laperriere out there." No, they want me. I said, "You're full
The ego.
Pat. Yeah, you love
The
it."
ego jumping in there. And again, when I think of Mike Farber and us two Americans coming up here to Montreal, and my return to Montreal back in 2011 coincided with and I remember we sat and did an article, and coincided with your bout with throat cancer, right? And in remission, obviously. How's things going? How are you feeling?
I'm great.
Yeah.
I'm great. When your age starts with a 7 rather, not a 70. Your age starts with a 7, and you get out of bed every day. Hey, things are good, so no complaints.
That's awesome. And I talked about that adversarial relationship between athletes and players. I never felt that with you, and obviously, I want to take the time and once again, and Tim here, but Tim, I had my knee replaced back in 18, 19, something like that. Anyway, I had a staph infection, ended up in the hospital, went through a pretty rough bout, and you know who your friends are when you see them visiting you in the hospital, and Mike came to see me. I was like, I wasn't shocked, but I was shocked. I mean, how the hell does Mike know I'm in here? And you came in, and I just want to let you know that meant a lot, and it touched my heart as a friend and a fellow human being. So you're a good man. You've always, to me, been a fair guy, and you're wonderful to listen to. You're the best storyteller. I just absolutely love you.
Well, thanks. Danielle and I were happy to visit you under those circumstances, and I'm glad you invited me on your little podcast.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Yeah, no, that storytelling's funny because I can, I could go on the internet and get all this information about you, right? That's what we were talking about, and act like and feel like I know you, and I have never met you. And technically, we haven't met in person, but here I am, and your storytelling, and it's amazing. It was awesome to interview you, and an honor, and I'm sure we can go on, and there's a lot of stuff we didn't even cover, but appreciate your time for sure, Mike.
Well, season 2, boys.